You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Si Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Si Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
On June 30th, 2022, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. took his oath of office and became the 17th president of the Philippines. That day officially marked the return of the Marcos political dynasty. Here he is speaking on Radio Television Malacanang.
This is a historic moment for us all. I feel it deep within me. You, the people, have spoken, and it is resounding.
The late Ferdinand Marcos Sr. ruled for almost 2 decades, much of that under martial law, marred by corruption, human rights abuses, and violence. Some argue Marcos Jr.'s win was the result of years of whitewashing and rewriting history. So, a year into his presidency, what are people saying? Philippine correspondent Buena Bernal joins me now to look at whether Bongbong has been able to step out of his father's long shadow. Hi, Buena. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Teresa. Happy to be here.
Now, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won the election last year in a landslide, 31 million votes. First off, how do Filipinos see him?
Well, if you look at the public's net satisfaction rating based on a survey by polling firm SWS, as of the fourth quarter of 2022, 75% of adult Filipinos are satisfied with the performance of Mr. Marcos Jr. as president, and 18% were undecided and only 7% were dissatisfied.
Okay, so those are encouraging figures for him and his administration. Can you give us some context? Explain to us. We know political families, powerful political families, such as the Marcos family, have long been a feature of Philippine politics. Why the resilience of such political dynasties?
Well, it's attributed to different factors, and one of them is the system of patronage politics evident in the country. There are political campaign financing challenges in the Philippines, and it has been proposed in the past that campaigns should be financed by the public, by the state coffers rather than privately, because if you have those campaign donations, the tendency is one becomes beholden to campaign financiers. So whether that affects appointments later on or policies later on that benefit certain business interests, what it does is it concentrates power to a select few, because then you have both political capital and business capital circling around the same group of people. So money is power. And when you're in office in the Philippines, it's almost self-perpetuating because there are soft projects, whether that's through scholarships, health aid, etc., and hard projects like infrastructure that also become tools of essentially enabling you to hold on to power. And in the case of Mr. Marcos Jr., that 31 million votes that he garnered in the 2022 presidential elections, that mandate, shows how popular he is as a president, because the Philippines has a multi-party system, which means it's extremely difficult to get the vote of the majority just by virtue of the number of political candidates there are. In his elections, 2022, it was a 10-way presidential race. So that's quite a number of people competing for a slice in the voting pie. And even under that setup, the 31 million votes is actually the first majority win by a Philippine president since the restoration of democracy in the country over 30 years ago. And that's an ironic political twist of fate, because Philippine democracy was restored after the ouster of President Marcos Jr.'s father, the late President Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the country for 2 decades, and some 14 years of which were under martial law, where thousands of dissidents were tortured, killed, detained without court warrant, or to this day have been victims of enforced disappearances. And there has been no apology heard from the Marcos family.
Buena, from the beginning, Mr. Marcos Jr. vowed to pursue an independent foreign policy. He didn't name nations specifically, but let's listen to this excerpt from his inaugural address.
Solutions from outside divided us. None deepened our understanding. They were always at our expense. Never forget, we are Filipinos. One nation, one republic, indivisible. We resisted and never failed to defeat foreign attempts to break up our country in my father's watch.
Now, Buena, the Philippine government continues to file protests against China's so-called illegal presence in the West Philippine Sea. How assertive has Mr. Marcos Jr. been when it comes to defending this maritime space?
In his first State of the Nation address, President Marcos Jr. has said that he will not give up a single inch of Philippine territory. And this portion of that address was actually the part that garnered the most and the longest applause from the in-person audience in that congressional hall where he delivered the speech. His stance is in stark contrast, at least perceptually, with what critics called the policy of appeasement towards China that former President Duterte was accused of having. Mr. Duterte, during his term, has sought warmer ties with Beijing. The relationship between the Philippines and China during Mr. Duterte's term elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And Mr. Duterte was seen as downplaying an important arbitral award the Philippines secured in 2016 that invalidated China's 9-line claim in a case that was seen as a David versus Goliath suit, because that case emanated from a standoff in 2012 in a common fishing ground for traditional or small-scale fishermen called Scarborough Shoal. And in that standoff, the internal conversations among high-ranking cabinet ministers was that the Philippines just cannot fight Beijing in those waters with the sheer power, material power that China had. So what they can do is invoke international law, and that was how that suit came about. So when Mr. Duterte was seen as downplaying that crucial win by the Philippines by saying things like, this is just a piece of paper that you can throw in the garbage, he really set the bar low and laid the carpet for his successor when it comes to territorial assertiveness, such as pronouncements that Mr. Marcos Jr. made suddenly becomes important, becomes a point of praise from across the political spectrum. He's been praised even by oppositionists during the Duterte administration. So in part because of that contrast, Mr. Marcos Jr.'s former stance of citing the award, always talking about the South China Sea or the fishermen who rely on the West Philippine Sea, which is how the country calls its territory there, has garnered praise.
And it's the people who make their livelihoods in those waters, the fishermen who are most directly affected. Do they feel like enough has been done to safeguard the waters?
It is a very tricky situation because they have had to adjust to the territorial dispute in ways we have not. So if you talk about what has been done, they're not necessarily privy to the conversations. They're not included, for example, in the closed-door conversations or the open line of communication between the Philippines and China. So if you ask them, do you feel enough has been done? The answer is really, they don't know, but they have hopes. So for example, in the Kalayaan Island groups in the South China Sea, fishermen would say, we're not allowed in areas near Sandy Cay because according to the Philippine Navy, we don't want to exacerbate the situation because that is an area already guarded by China's vessels. So they have concerns as to why they can't do that. But at the same time, there is an argument that there needs to be some adjustments made so that stability is ensured in those waters, or not just stability, but also their safety, because there's also a risk of a threat to their safety if they push for growing into those waters. So that's in the Spratly Islands. In the Scarborough Shoal, fishermen there say they're still not allowed to enter a crucial lagoon that is resource-rich, where they typically, for example, stay there when the weather is not too good, or where it is easier to fish in that area.
During the previous Rodrigo Duterte administration, U.S.-Philippine relations were in a very delicate place. But China's maritime aggression really prompted the Philippines to embrace Washington as a security ally. How are the two countries' ties shaping up now under the administration of President Marcos Jr.?
Both China and the United States are trading partners with the Philippines. And while there were friendlier ties between China and the Philippines during the Duterte administration, people view Mr. Marcos Jr.'s move, for example, to allow the United States to kind of have access to more bases in the Philippines as a pivot back to the United States. But there's also an argument there where the United States has always been the Philippines' longtime military treaty ally. They have mutual defense treaty where each country will come to each other's aid should an attack on their assets, including vessels in the South China Sea, occur, as if it is an attack on the other. Of course, that is subject to congressional approval, as both countries' constitutions require. But if you look at it, that relationship between the United States and the Philippines is special because United States is the Philippines' only military treaty ally. And the Philippines is the United States' oldest ally in the Indo-Pacific. Filipino and U.S. troops have fought alongside each other in the Korean War, Vietnam War, in World War II. That's a long-standing relationship that a small change in policy directive by, say, 1 or 2 terms of a president or a state leader cannot simply change overnight, because those partners already have layers within them, within institutions. And even if you look at the military establishment in the Philippines, by virtue of that long-standing partnership, they have interoperability, or they're able to work with each other. They have yearly military exercises. And so even at the mid-level of that military establishment, you really have pro-U.S. opinions there.
Fascinating. It is quite undeniable history between the two. Now, the South China Sea is at the heart of disputes involving claims and counterclaims among several countries. But have you ever considered tourism as a tool to ease tensions? More with me and Buena after this.
Hey everyone, my name's Stephen Chia, and I'm host of CNA's weekly news podcast, Heart of the Matter. Now each week, my job is to ask questions you have, like why is the COE so high? Why aren't singles dating? Or what is going on with the red-hot property market in Singapore? If you want the views behind the news, then tune in each week as we get to the heart of the matter. We are on the CNA and Me Listen apps and wherever you get your podcasts. Hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode when it drops.
Welcome back. On my list of places I want to visit, Buena, I have Hokkaido, Tel Aviv, Ankara, but the South China Sea really is not exactly my idea of a vacation destination. But there is actually a tour that takes people to the Spratly Islands, isn't there?
That's right. And we had the opportunity to join that tour. That was the only tour this year for paying guests, and that included both local and foreign tourists. And if you look at it, it's also a way to assert the country's claims in those Philippine-occupied territories in the Spratly Islands. The Philippines calls it down there the Kalayaan Island Group or the Freedom Island Group. So the tour was called the Freedom Expedition or the Kalayaan Expedition. There are analysts who say that that is means of utilizing soft power because you're bringing more civilians in an area where it's been recorded that there has been military buildup of the features there. And even for the Philippine-occupied features, for example, the Philippines has military outposts there. So bringing more civilians there, when that tour was done, it almost felt like a litmus test as to how Chinese militia vessels, the China Coast Guard, would react to civilians visiting the area. Mm-hmm. And it so happens when we were there, unlike what happens when a Philippine Coast Guard vessel is there, there was no challenge, verbal challenge or radio challenge by the China Coast Guard saying, you should leave the area, this is Chinese territory. Instead, there was radio silence, and it almost felt like the funny thing about that tour as well was it wasn't just the tour yacht that wasn't challenged because of the de facto ban on Filipino fishermen imposed, as they told me, by Philippine authorities there for them not to go near Sandy Cay. Some tourists decided to go to Sandy Cay just to see the reaction of the Chinese vessels guarding that area. And I joined that group of tourists. And they were scared, nervous on the journey to Sandy Cay from Thitu, which is also a Philippine-occupied island, locally known as Pag-asa or Hope. And in our entire journey, or even our entire stay, where they basically swam, had fun, even ran around Sandy Cay, or one of the 3 sandbars of Sandy Cay, with the Philippine flag, there was no reaction from the Chinese vessels guarding the area. And typically, in past reports, if it was a Philippine Navy rubber boat, there have been incidents where a rubber boat would be sent off from that China Coast Guard vessel to take away debris from the Philippine Navy rubber boat. Things like that, which the tourists were anticipating in a way, or at least were guarding against. It didn't happen.
Wow, it's fascinating to hear someone who has been to that disputed area and share the levity that can come from a visit like that. Okay, let's transition from water to power now. Let's talk about the issue of energy. The Philippines, highly dependent on coal, but there's a global push towards a green transition, and the Philippines is very much in need of energy diversification. How attractive has the country become for investors under the current president? What has Mr. Marcos Jr. done to attract the dollars?
Renewable energy is among the sectors he is marketing to international investors. Along with that, you have agriculture. You also have infrastructure in terms of both mobility and also internet connectivity. And when it comes to President Marcos Jr.'s appeal, he's potentially looking at tapping nuclear to prevent a power crisis in the country. But also, I spoke with economist Dr. Alvin Ang, who tells me while these sectors, agriculture, renewable energy, infrastructure, are being marketed as open for investments, well, they could potentially immediately have short and midterm profits. It's also important to attract dollars for sectors that lead to human capital development, sectors that may not necessarily be high profit sectors, but would nonetheless support our service-driven economy by ensuring that sustainable human capital, so sectors like health, education, he says, are still important to be part of that array of industries that is marketed to international investors.
So here we are, 1 year down, 5 more to go. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. will remain in the seat of power for some time to come. Buena, are there any fears among Filipinos that this presidency will be similar to his father's? And tell us briefly about the challenges that lie ahead.
The fact of the matter is, there have been checks and balances that were set up after the dictatorship of Mr. Marcos Sr. That includes, for example, the revival of the Commission on Human Rights, an independent body under the current constitution that would probe and look into human rights abuses in the country. But foreign policy-wise, you see that the son, Mr. Marcos Jr., has been drawing praise from across the political spectrum. And whether these are goodwill gestures to get him on their side for policies or directives that they're lobbying for, including citing the arbitral award before the United Nations General Assembly, or shoring up support from the international community for that international arbitral award, still you see that this is a stark contrast from the dying days of martial law under his father. Governance-wise, there are criticisms over the frequency of his travels abroad. And supporters are justifying this as trips that supposedly have return on investments because he is selling the Philippines to the world, he is talking to investors, etc. There's also the Maharlika Investment Fund, a proposal for supposedly somewhat of a sovereign wealth fund for the Philippines that the Marcos Jr. administration is saying is a priority for the country. But critics are saying that it shouldn't be because the country has a deficit and it shouldn't be putting investments or putting government money into the whims of the market. But one potential legacy in the making for Mr. Marcos Jr. is in the aspect of agriculture, which has been a problem in the Philippines. There have been problems with the increase in prices of agricultural products because of the lack of agrotechnology that can help the farmer directly market their products to the consumer. And so in the agriculture industry, it is typically the middleman in the Philippines that actually profits from the labor of the farmer. And Mr. Marcos Jr. is sitting as the agriculture secretary. So that portfolio is in his hands, and that's a potential legacy in the making. But in Philippine politics, Teresa, as we've seen time and again in the past, where the country has witnessed a dictatorship, a peaceful revolt, a failed presidential impeachment, the fact is, in the Philippines, you never really know that twist of political fate that could happen.
Yeah, never a dull day, Buena. Thank you so much. A fascinating time to observe Filipino politics.
Thank you so much for having me, Teresa.
Thanks for coming on, Buena. The TV version of CNA Correspondent airs on CNA every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Catch up with them anytime on cna.asia. The team behind this episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and me, Teresa Tang. Thanks for listening.